He was sterile. Those 3 words hang in the courtroom like a guillotine blade, suspended above my sister's carefully constructed web of lies. I watch as Sarah's face crumples, her perfectly applied makeup unable to mask the naked panic in her eyes. The baby, her precious James Jr., sleeps peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the storm swirling around him. Blood rushes in my ears as the judge reviews the medical records my lawyer has just submitted. My hands tremble slightly in my lap, the weight of the past year pressing down on my shoulders like a physical burden. First widowed, then betrayed, now vindicated. But vindication tastes more bitter than sweet. Life has a way of changing in an instant. One minute you're 32, happily married and planning your future. The next, you're a widow sorting through cremation options because your husband's body was too damaged to have an open casket. That's what happened to me, Karen. 6 months ago, my husband James died in a car accident that left me drowning in grief and struggling to find my footing in this new reality. I remember staring at the funeral director, his words blurring together as he described our options. I wanted to scream that there were no options. My husband was gone, and nothing could change that. The first few weeks were a blur of funeral arrangements, consoling phone calls, and sleepless nights. If it wasn't for my parents stepping in to handle most of the funeral details, I'm not sure how I would have managed. Karen, honey, we've arranged everything with the funeral home, Mom had said, her voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. You just focus on yourself right now. The support group for people who had lost loved ones became my lifeline. Every Tuesday evening, I'd sit in a circle with others who understood the hollow ache in my chest. Some days are harder than others, I shared during one session, my voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I wake up and, for a split second, I forget he's gone. Maria, another group member who lost her husband 2 years ago, reached over and squeezed my hand. That's normal, sweetie. The grief comes in waves. I didn't tell them about the wedding ring I still wore, or how I'd catch myself buying his favorite cereal at the grocery store, only to remember halfway through checkout that he would never eat breakfast across from me again. As the months passed, I started dealing with practical matters. James had left me well provided for. Our house in the suburbs, an apartment downtown, and a substantial bank account. I could have quit my job at the marketing firm, but the thought of sitting alone in our empty house all day made my skin crawl. Instead, I switched to part-time, working just enough to keep my mind occupied. I remember James's careful financial planning, how he'd insisted on generous life insurance policies for both of us. It's morbid, he'd said with that crooked smile of his, but it's responsible. At the time, I'd rolled my eyes, never imagining I'd be the one to benefit from his foresight. The most surprising change came in my relationship with my parents. Growing up, I'd always felt like an afterthought compared to my younger sister, Sarah. They never missed her dance recitals or school plays, while my academic achievements barely warranted a congratulations. I can still see myself at 17, clutching my acceptance letter to Columbia. A full scholarship that I'd worked toward since freshman year. Mom had glanced up from preparing Sarah's costume for her community theater debut, offering a distracted "that's nice, dear" before returning to her stitching. But after James's death, something shifted. When they asked if I could help them financially with a monthly transfer of $1,500, I agreed without hesitation. Perhaps this was the price of their attention, a voice whispered in the back of my mind, but I pushed it away. They were my parents, and I needed them now more than ever. The weekly dinners at my parents' house had become a comforting routine. Mom would cook her famous pot roast, Dad would pour the wine, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had their full attention. Karen, tell us more about that new project you're working on, Dad would say, actually interested in my work for once. The marketing campaign's going well, I'd share, savoring these moments of connection. My boss thinks it might bring in several new clients. But everything shifted the night Sarah joined us for dinner. My younger sister walked in 7 months pregnant, her presence immediately commanding the room like it always had. She'd been living in a rented apartment across town, and I hadn't seen her since James's funeral. "Sarah, sweetie, sit here," Mom fussed, practically pushing me aside to make room for her favorite daughter. "Do you need another pillow? Are your feet swollen?" Just like that, I became invisible again. It was like watching a switch flip. Suddenly, all their attention laser focused on Sarah and her pregnancy. The familiar ache of being overlooked settled back into my chest, an old friend I'd foolishly thought I'd left behind. I remember how James would notice when this happened, how he'd squeeze my hand under the table or find subtle ways to bring the conversation back to me. Without him there as my buffer, the old family dynamics snapped back into place like an elastic band. "So who's the father?" I asked during dinner, trying to join the conversation. "Have you told him about the baby?" Sarah's face darkened. "That's my business," she snapped, pushing her peas around her plate. "I don't need to share every detail of my personal life." Mom jumped to her defense immediately. "Karen, don't pry. Your sister doesn't have to explain herself to anyone." I couldn't help but notice how different this response was from when I was going through fertility treatments. Back then, they'd had no problem demanding updates and offering unsolicited advice about my personal life. The memory of Mom's voice on the phone after each failed attempt still stung. "Maybe you're trying too hard, Karen. Sarah got pregnant once without even trying. Of course, she didn't keep it, but still. But how are you planning to manage on your own?" I pressed during another dinner, watching her heap seconds onto her plate. "Babies are expensive." Sarah waved her hand dismissively, that familiar smirk playing on her lips. "Don't worry about my baby. We won't need anything from anyone. I've got it all figured out." I should have paid more attention to that mysterious smile, but I'd seen it too many times before. Sarah was always cooking up get-rich-quick schemes that never panned out. The organic smoothie business that lasted 2 weeks, the life coaching certification she never finished, the cryptocurrency investment that lost her 3 months' rent. "Trust me," she said, patting her belly with an air of confidence that should have set off alarm bells. "This time, everything is going to work out exactly as planned." Dad beamed at her like she'd just announced a cure for cancer. That's my girl, always landing on her feet. I took another bite of pot roast, trying to swallow down the familiar feeling of being second best. Some things never change, I thought, watching my parents hang on Sarah's every word. The golden child and the afterthought. Roles cast in childhood concrete. The call from Sarah came on a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk, reviewing marketing reports when my phone lit up with her name. I almost let it go to voicemail. Our conversations were usually brief and awkward. But something made me answer. "Karen," her voice had that sugary sweetness she only used when she wanted something. "I'm having my baby shower next weekend at Mom and Dad's. I'd really love it if you could come." The invitation caught me off guard. The last real conversation we'd had was at James's funeral, and even then, she'd seemed distracted and uncomfortable. "Are you sure?" I asked, unable to hide my surprise. I could count on one hand the number of times Sarah had voluntarily included me in anything. Of course, she laughed, the sound oddly forced. "You're my only sister. It wouldn't be right without you. Plus, I have something special planned." Something in her tone made my stomach clench, but I pushed the feeling aside. "I'll be there," I promised, already mentally listing possible gift ideas. Maybe this was her way of trying to bridge the gap between us. As I hung up, I thought of James. "Give her a chance," he would say whenever Sarah and I argued. "She's immature, but she's still your sister." His voice was so clear in my memory, I could almost believe he was standing beside me. The following Saturday, I arrived at my parents' house carrying 2 carefully wrapped packages. A high-end baby monitor and a handmade blanket. Despite our differences, this was my future niece or nephew. The place looked like a pastel explosion had hit it. Pink and blue balloons everywhere, streamers hanging from every surface, and a towering diaper cake centerpiece. Trust Sarah to turn this into an event. She'd invited what looked like half the town. Aunt Margaret was there with her daughters, Mom's bridge club friends occupied the sofa, and Sarah's old college roommates clustered around the punch bowl, giggling over some shared memory. "Time for games," Sarah announced, wading through the crowd in a flowing maternity dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was glowing, but there was something predatory in her smile that made me uneasy. Her eyes kept finding mine across the room, holding my gaze a beat too long. We played all the traditional baby shower games. Measuring Sarah's belly with string, guessing the baby's birth date, and that horrible melted chocolate bar in diaper game. I won the belly measuring contest, which seemed to irritate Sarah more than it should have. Throughout it all, she kept shooting these strange looks my way, like she was waiting for something. After the gifts were opened, Sarah cooing over each onesie and baby gadget with theatrical enthusiasm. She reached my presents. She held up the blanket, running her fingers over the intricate pattern. Then she clinked her glass for attention. The room fell silent, and my heart started racing for no reason I could name. The air felt suddenly thick, hard to breathe. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," she began, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "But there's something else I need to share. I think it's time everyone knew who the father of my baby is." My heart started pounding. Sarah's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew. I knew before the words left her mouth, but that didn't lessen the impact. "The father," she said, her voice ringing through the suddenly silent room, "is James Wilson. Karen's late husband." The world tilted sideways. Through the roaring in my ears, I could hear gasps and whispers from the guests. Aunt Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Sarah's college friends huddled closer together, whispering frantically. But what hit me hardest was the lack of surprise on my parents' faces. They had known all along. In that moment, I felt James die a second time. The man I'd mourned, the loving, faithful husband, had never existed. The grief I'd been carrying wasn't just for a person, but for a marriage that had been built on lies. Before I could process what was happening, Sarah was already speaking again, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she turned to face me directly. "As James's baby is his only heir, I'm entitled to half of everything he left you, Karen. The house, the apartment, the money. My child deserves their father's inheritance." The room spun. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. But then Mom and Dad stepped forward, flanking Sarah like bodyguards. "Karen," Dad said, using his stern business voice, "you need to do the right thing here. Your nephew deserves his father's legacy." I found my voice, though it came out as a rasp. "You're lying. All of you are lying. James would never?" "Oh no," Sarah's smile turned cruel as she pulled out her phone. "Then how do you explain these?" She held up the screen, and my world collapsed all over again. There they were. James and Sarah wrapped in each other's arms, kissing in what looked like a hotel room. Another photo showed them holding hands in a restaurant I didn't recognize. The man in the photos wore my husband's face, but his expression was different. Hungry, reckless, a version of James I'd never seen. Had I been blind, or had he been that good at compartmentalizing his life? "He loved me," Sarah declared, her voice carrying across the silent room. "He was planning to leave you for me. We were going to tell everyone, but then," she choked, looked up, tears streaming down her face, "then the accident happened and all our plans?" I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My body moved on autopilot. Gathering my purse, pushing past the whispering guests, stumbling out to my car. I heard Mom calling after me, but I was already backing out of the driveway. The drive home was a blur, my mind kept replaying those photos, trying to make sense of them. The restaurant photos must have been taken during those business dinners he claimed to have. The hotel, probably during his frequent work trips. I thought of the times he'd come home late, smelling of unfamiliar cologne that he claimed was a new aftershave. The weekends he'd spent catching up on work while I visited my parents alone. The way he'd grown distant during our fertility treatments, as if my inability to conceive had created an unbridgeable gap between us. My phone started buzzing as soon as I walked through my front door. Sarah was sending messages. Dozens of them. Screenshots of conversations between her and James. I don't love her anymore. I haven't for a long time. We'll tell everyone after the divorce. You're the only one I want to be with. I can't wait to start our life together. Message after message appeared on my screen, each one a fresh knife in my heart. The timestamps showed conversations going back months. My husband and my sister plotting their future while I underwent fertility treatments, believing I was the problem in our marriage. I spent that night pacing through my house, touching James's things and wondering if everything about our life together had been a lie. The first call from my parents came at 7 a.m. sharp. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Karen, you need to be reasonable about this," Dad started, not even bothering with a greeting. "The sooner you agree to split the inheritance, the easier this will be for everyone." The casual arrogance in his voice made my blood boil. "Easier for whom? For Sarah? For you?" "For all of us," Mom chimed in. I was on speakerphone. "You don't want this to get messy, dear." When the word came out as barely more than a whisper, "When did you know about them?" There was a pause. The kind of hesitation that tells you everything you need to know before a word is spoken. We've known for a while," Mom finally admitted. "James confided in us about 6 months before, well, before the accident." The timeline hit me like a physical blow. 6 months. They'd known for 6 months and still let me cry on their shoulders at his funeral. Still accepted my money every month while knowing what he and Sarah had done. Traitors, the word felt cold and final on my tongue. "All of you." I hung up and blocked their numbers. My hand shook as I opened my banking app, but I didn't hesitate to cancel the monthly transfer to their account. Let them ask their precious Sarah for money. I wondered if my parents had ever truly loved me, or if I'd always been just a resource to them. First as the responsible daughter who didn't cause trouble, then as a financial safety net. Perhaps they'd raised me to be reliable precisely for this purpose. To take care of Sarah when her schemes inevitably fell apart. 2 weeks passed in a fog of missed calls and ignored text messages. Then came Sarah's email. She'd sue me if I didn't voluntarily give up half of everything. The word voluntarily had never looked so much like a curse. I couldn't bear to reply, couldn't bear to think about James's betrayal. About how many people must have known, must have seen them together while I remained oblivious. The whispers at work became unbearable. Pitying looks from some colleagues, barely concealed smirks from others. Tom, my boss and one of the few true friends I had left, called me into his office after I broke down in the middle of a client meeting. "Take some time off," he said gently. "Paid or unpaid, whatever works for you. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back." I nodded gratefully and packed up my desk that same day. The next few weeks blurred together as I became a hermit in my own home. I had groceries delivered, ignored the doorbell when it rang, and spent hours staring at old photos, trying to spot the signs I must have missed. Every happy memory now felt like a mockery, every moment of our marriage tainted by the knowledge that he had been living a double life with my own sister. The news came via Facebook. Sarah had given birth to a boy. The photo showed her beaming in a hospital bed, our parents hovering proudly over their new grandson. The baby was wrapped in the cream-colored blanket I had knitted for the shower, which felt like a deliberate jab. I closed the app before I could read the comments, but not before noticing she'd named him James Jr. A week later, the court summons arrived in a thick manila envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it, already knowing what I'd find inside. Sarah was suing for half of everything James had left me, claiming her son's right to his father's inheritance. The legal language was cold and precise, laying out her demands in stark black and white. She wanted the house, half the money, and partial ownership of the downtown apartment. I spent 3 days researching lawyers before settling on Richard Martinez, who came highly recommended for handling complex inheritance cases. "Miss Wilson," he said, shuffling through the papers on his desk, his expression carefully neutral, "I have to be honest with you. Your sister has compelling evidence of a long-term relationship with your late husband. Text messages, photos, witness statements including your own parents. He paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. In inheritance cases like this, proof of an intimate relationship combined with a biological child, well, the courts tend to be sympathetic. I was still processing this devastating news when my phone rang that evening. Unknown number. Hello, is this Karen Wilson? A woman's voice, unfamiliar but somehow striking a chord of recognition. Something in the cadence, the tone, made my heart skip. I'm Elizabeth Parker, James's mother. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the kitchen counter for support. That's impossible, I whispered. James was an orphan. He told me his parents died when he was young. He grew up in foster care. Another one of his lies, I'm afraid. Her voice was bitter but not unkind. Would you be willing to meet with me? There are things you need to know. Things that might help you. In that moment, I realized how little I'd actually known about James. Even his most basic history. The orphan story that had made me so protective of him had been fabricated. The man I'd married was a stranger. We arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown the next morning. Neutral ground. I arrived early, my stomach in knots, ordered a coffee I couldn't drink, and nearly dropped the cup when she walked in. The resemblance was uncanny. James had her eyes, her smile, even the way she carried herself. She moved with the same fluid grace I'd always admired in him. I was at the funeral, she said after we'd settled into a corner booth, far from curious ears. Back row, black dress and veil. I couldn't bring myself to approach you then. James and I hadn't spoken in years. I remembered her suddenly. The solitary figure who'd slipped out before the service ended. I'd been too lost in my own grief to wonder who she was, but now the memory crystallized with perfect clarity. The elegant woman in black standing apart from the other mourners, her face hidden behind a dark veil. Why are you coming forward now? I asked, trying to keep the suspicion out of my voice. After all the recent revelations about James, I found it hard to trust anything or anyone connected to him. Elizabeth reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila envelope, worn at the edges as if it had been carried around for a long time. Because I've heard about what your sister is claiming, and because, despite everything, I can't let another woman suffer from my son's lies. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid the envelope across the table. I saw in her eyes the same pain I'd been carrying. A mother who had lost her son long before his death, who had known the person behind the charming facade. I wondered what James had done to cause their estrangement, what lies he had told her that had finally severed their relationship. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope Elizabeth had given me. Inside were medical records from Boston General Hospital, dated 10 years ago. About a year before James and I got married. My eyes scanned the document, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Complete azoospermia, permanently sterile, no possibility of natural conception. The clinical terms jumped out at me, each one a fresh blow. James had these tests done when he was 25, Elizabeth explained softly. He was devastated by the results. It was one of the last things we discussed before our falling out. I couldn't speak. All those years of fertility treatments. The endless doctor's appointments, the hormone injections, the tears and self-blame. It had all been a cruel charade. I remembered how James would hold me when I cried after each negative pregnancy test. We'll keep trying, he'd whisper, stroking my hair. It'll happen for us someday. All while knowing it was biologically impossible. The depths of his deception were unfathomable. So here I sit, in a courtroom packed with spectators, watching as Sarah's carefully constructed world crumbles around her. Sarah sits in the front row, cradling baby James Jr. while our parents flank her protectively. She dressed the part of a grieving almost widow perfectly. Demure black dress, minimal makeup, practiced look of sorrow. When she took the stand, she played to the gallery masterfully, tears glistening in her eyes as she described her great love with James. All I want is what's fair for my son, she declared, her voice breaking. He deserves his father's legacy. My lawyer, Mr. Martinez, waited until she'd finished her performance before he spoke. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that proves Miss Thompson's entire claim is fraudulent. He approached the bench with the hospital records. The judge reviewed the documents, her expression unchanging. Sarah's lawyer jumped up, objecting about chain of custody and document authenticity. Sarah's composure cracked. "Those documents are fake," she shrieked, clutching the baby closer. "She forged them to steal my baby's inheritance." Your Honor, Mr. Martinez continued calmly, "Given these medical records show Mr. Wilson was sterile, we request a DNA test to establish paternity." Sarah's smile was triumphant. "That's impossible. James was an orphan, and his body was cremated. There's no one to test against." "Actually," Mr. Martinez said, gesturing to the gallery, "I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Parker, James Wilson's biological mother." Elizabeth stood, and a murmur ran through the courtroom. Even from where I sat, I could see Sarah's face turn ashen. "I'm willing to submit to a DNA test," Elizabeth announced clearly, "to determine if this child is my grandson." The judge nodded. "DNA testing is ordered. We'll reconvene when the results are available." Sarah swayed slightly in her seat, all color drained from her face. Our mother rushed to support her, shooting me a venomous look. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope. The courtroom is silent as the judge opens the envelope containing the DNA test results. Sarah sits rigidly in her chair, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the drama unfolding around him. "The results conclusively show," the judge announces, her voice clear and firm, "that there is no genetic relationship between the minor child and Mrs. Elizabeth Parker. Therefore, it can be concluded that James Wilson was not the father of this child." A collective gasp fills the room. Sarah's face crumples as she begins to sob, mascara running down her cheeks. "Miss Thompson," the judge's voice has turned stern, "would you care to explain why you perpetrated this fraud upon the court?" Sarah clutches the baby closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was seeing several men at the time. When James died and was cremated, I thought no one would ever know. He had money, and I needed. So you attempted to defraud your own sister, the judge's disapproval is palpable, used your parents as unwitting accomplices in this scheme?" "I just wanted security for my baby," Sarah whimpers, but her performance has lost its power. Even our parents look stunned, finally realizing the extent of her deception. The judge's ruling is swift and unequivocal. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Karen Wilson. All claims to Wilson's estate by Sarah Thompson are dismissed with prejudice. "Miss Thompson, you're fortunate that Mrs. Wilson hasn't pressed criminal charges for attempted fraud. As I watch my sister's tears, I feel no satisfaction. Only exhaustion and a strange sense of emptiness. The sister I grew up with, competed with, envied, and occasionally admired, has become someone I no longer recognize. Or perhaps this is who she always was, and I simply refuse to see it." Outside the courthouse, my parents approach me. Mom is crying, Dad looking older than I've ever seen him. "Karen, sweetheart," Mom reaches for my hand. "We had no idea Sarah was lying. We can make this right. We've been struggling since you stopped the monthly transfers." I see them now through new eyes. Not as the towering figures of my childhood, but as flawed, aging people who had always taken the path of least resistance. Supporting the daughter who demanded attention rather than the one who quietly succeeded. Perhaps they had never intended to hurt me, but their choices had left scars nonetheless. I hold up my hand. "Don't. Just don't." I pull out my phone, block their numbers right there, and walk away without looking back. Elizabeth is waiting by my car. "Are you okay?" she asks softly. I surprise myself by laughing. "You know what? I think I actually am. Or I will be." I take a deep breath. I've been thinking about that apartment downtown that James left me. I never liked it much. Too many memories. But maybe you'd like it. Her eyes widen. "Karen, no, I couldn't possibly." "Please," I insist. "You gave me back my life with those medical records. Let me give you something in return. When I handed her the keys a week later, she broke down crying. I never thought I'd have a daughter, she whispered as she hugged me. That was 3 months ago. My family still tries to reach me through mutual friends and distant relatives, but I've cut those ties too. Sarah sent a letter claiming she's changed, that she's sorry, that she needs help with the baby. I threw it away unopened. Instead, I have weekly dinners with Elizabeth. We're getting to know each other, sharing stories about James. The good and the bad. She's helping me see that while he wasn't the man I thought he was, that doesn't invalidate all the happy moments we shared. Elizabeth has shown me photos of James as a child. A serious boy with watchful eyes. He was always good at becoming whoever people wanted him to be, she told me once. I think he forgot who he really was. I wonder sometimes if he ever knew himself at all, or if his entire life was a performance, tailored to each audience. Yesterday, I finally packed away James's remaining things. Elizabeth helped me donate some to charity and store others in the attic. As we worked, she told me stories about James as a little boy, before the lies began. It helped, somehow, to know that version of him existed. I'm not ready to date yet, but I've started living again. I returned to work full-time, joined a hiking club, and am planning my first solo vacation. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I barely recognize the woman looking back at me. Life has a way of surprising you. I lost the family I was born into but gained a new one I never expected. It's not the life I planned, but maybe it's the life I was meant to have all along. As I trace the familiar lines of my face in the mirror each morning, I see someone stronger than the woman who wants to find herself through others' eyes. First my parents, then James's. The betrayals hurt, still ache on quiet nights, but they've also carved away the parts of me that were too willing to overlook the truth for the comfort of belonging. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if Elizabeth hadn't come forward, if the truth had remained buried. Would I have eventually given in to Sarah's demands? Would I have spent my life believing James had betrayed me with my sister? The thought sends a chill through me even now. Elizabeth says James was always running from something. From his own inadequacies, from the fear of being truly known. He made himself into whoever he thought people wanted, she told me once over dinner, her eyes sad but clear. With me, he was the devoted son until I questioned him too closely. With you, the perfect husband until the fertility issues threatened that image. He couldn't bear to be seen as less than ideal. I think about how James would deflect whenever conversations turned too personal, how he'd charm his way out of uncomfortable situations. The way he'd carefully curate our social media presence, insisting on retakes of photos until we looked like the perfect couple. The cultivated image of success that meant everything to him. The DNA test results haven't just freed me from Sarah's claims. They've released me from doubting my own memories. I can keep the good parts of my marriage without wondering if every moment was a lie. Some were real. Some weren't. I'm learning to live with that ambiguity. The apartment feels different now. Lighter somehow, as if the shadows of deception have finally been cleared away. I've repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, claimed the space as truly mine for the first time. Elizabeth has become an unexpected gift in all this chaos. Last week, she brought over old photo albums and shared stories of James's childhood. His science fair projects, his love of model airplanes, the dog he had growing up. He wasn't always the man he became, she said softly. There was goodness in him once. It was strangely comforting to hear, to know that the James the first loved wasn't entirely a fiction. Perhaps that's the most difficult lesson in all of this. That people aren't simply good or bad, honest or deceitful. We're all capable of both cruelty and kindness, of constructing elaborate facades while hiding our truest selves. James, Sarah, my parents. They all made choices that hurt me deeply, but they're still human, still complex in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I've started therapy, something James always subtly discouraged. Why pay someone to listen when you have me, he'd say with that charming smile that used to melt my defenses. Now I understand why. A therapist might have helped me see the inconsistencies I was trained to overlook. My therapist says grief isn't linear, that healing comes in fits and starts. Some days I feel almost whole again. Others, I find myself crying in the cereal aisle when I accidentally reach for James's favorite brand. But the good days are becoming more frequent than the bad. I ran into Sarah at the grocery store last week. She looked different. The carefully applied makeup and designer clothes replaced by yoga pants and a messy ponytail. The baby, I can't bring myself to call him James Jr., was strapped to her chest in a carrier, sleeping peacefully. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the produce section, neither knowing what to say. She looked away first, mumbling something about needing to go. As I watched her hurry away, I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. She's still my sister, still the girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms because she was afraid of the lightning. Maybe someday we'll find a way back to each other. But not yet. Not while the wounds are still healing. For now, I'm learning to embrace this unplanned life. Last night, I had dinner with Elizabeth and showed her my itinerary for my upcoming trip to Portugal. A country James and I had always talked about visiting but never did. "You're going alone?" she asked, sounding both impressed and concerned. I nodded, feeling a surge of both excitement and anxiety at the thought. "I need to know I can," I told her. "That I'm enough, just me." She squeezed my hand, her eyes so like James's but warmer, more genuine, filling with tears. "You always were," she said simply. And for the first time in a very long time, I'm starting to believe it. Life has a way of breaking you open, of stripping away the comfortable illusions we build around ourselves. But sometimes, in that breaking, we find something stronger underneath. A resilience we never knew we possessed, a truth we were too afraid to see. I'm not the woman I was a year ago. I'm someone new, someone still emerging from the wreckage of what I thought my life would be. And day by day, I'm discovering that this new person isn't someone to mourn, but someone to celebrate. Someone who finally, after all these years, belongs to herself.